He lived in a small apartment on the edge of the city, where the streets were always noisy, and the neighbors' voices carried through the thin walls. Every day was a struggle to balance work, life, and his passion for music. He worked long hours in a small shop, handling tasks that paid the bills but left little time for anything else. Yet, every evening, after the last customer left and the lights were turned off, he would quietly slip away to his tiny corner of the apartment where a second-hand piano sat. It was old, scratched, and some of its keys were slightly out of tune, but to him it was a treasure. From a young age, he had been fascinated by music. While other kids spent their afternoons playing outside or watching television, he spent hours listening to old piano recordings, trying to understand the emotion behind each note. He didn't have lessons or formal training. Everything he knew about the piano came from watching, listening, and practicing tirelessly, sometimes until his fingers ached and his eyes blurred from concentration. People around him often laughed at his dedication. His coworkers would tease him for spending so much time with what they called an impractical hobby. "Why waste your life on something that won't pay the bills?" they would say, smirking as they counted their tips or hurried to finish their tasks. Even some family members thought he was wasting his time. They couldn't understand how someone could be so consumed by a dream that seemed so far out of reach. Despite the teasing, he never let their words stop him. In fact, it only fueled his determination. He learned to tune out the noise, focusing instead on the sound of the piano and the feelings it evoked. Each note he played was a step closer to something he couldn't quite describe, something that felt bigger than himself. He imagined himself performing in grand halls, hearing applause, feeling the connection with every person listening. It was a dream he kept to himself, afraid that if he shared it, people would laugh even harder. His neighbors had long grown used to the sound of piano notes drifting from his apartment each evening. Some would stop by their windows, curious at first, but after a while, they dismissed it as a background noise, just another part of the city's constant hum. Few paid attention to the passion behind the music, seeing only an ordinary man tapping away on a battered instrument. He had a routine. After work, he would eat a small dinner, sometimes just bread and fruit, then sit at the piano and let his fingers find their way across the keys. Sometimes he would try to recreate melodies he had heard on the radio or in recordings, and other times, he would close his eyes and let the music flow from his own imagination. It was during these moments that he felt truly alive, as if nothing else in the world mattered. Time seemed to bend around him, and the worries of life melted away. Friends and colleagues often found it hard to understand this obsession. Some invited him to join them for drinks or outings, but he would politely decline, promising to catch up later. Deep down, he knew that every hour spent away from the piano was an hour he could have used to improve, to explore new compositions, to get closer to the music he loved. It was a lonely path, but one he embraced fully, knowing that the satisfaction of progress was worth more than temporary pleasures. Sometimes he would play in the park when the weather allowed. People passing by would occasionally pause to listen, offering a polite nod or smile. Rarely did anyone stop long enough to truly appreciate the depth of his playing. But he didn't mind. The music was for him as much as it was for anyone else. It was a way to express thoughts and emotions that he couldn't put into words, a way to tell his story without speaking. He also recorded himself whenever he could, using a small, old device. Listening back was sometimes disappointing. He could hear mistakes, hear the moments where the music fell short of what he imagined. But those recordings also offered a chance to track progress, to identify patterns, and to find areas to improve. Over time, the mistakes became fewer, and his confidence grew, even if only slightly each day. Despite the challenges, he found joy in the smallest victories. When a melody came out exactly as he envisioned it, or when a sequence of chords flowed naturally under his fingers, it felt like a tiny triumph over the world that constantly doubted him. He began to understand that mastery wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about connection, between the mind, the fingers, and the heart. And in those quiet moments, alone in his apartment, he felt connected to something much larger than himself. His life was not without struggles. Money was tight, and opportunities to showcase his talent were few. Friends worried about his future, fearing that his focus on the piano would lead to disappointment. He faced rejection from potential teachers and opportunities, each one a small blow to his self-esteem. Yet, every setback only reinforced his resolve. He learned to adapt, to find ways to practice and grow despite limitations. Late at night, when the city slept and only the distant hum of traffic could be heard, he would sit at the piano and lose himself in sound. Sometimes he would play for hours without pause, crafting intricate passages, experimenting with rhythm and tempo. The music became a language, a way to communicate with the world on a level deeper than speech. And in those moments he felt free from ridicule, free from doubt, free from the limitations of his circumstances. The apartment, the old piano, and the quiet nights became his sanctuary. Each day he would wake with a renewed determination, thinking about the melodies he wanted to explore, the skills he wanted to sharpen, and the dream he refused to let go. He had no guarantee of success, no promise that anyone would ever recognize his talent, but he played anyway. Because for him, playing the piano was not just a hobby or a pastime. It was a calling, a purpose, and a lifeline all at once. Through all this, a small hope began to grow. He imagined a day when people would stop laughing, when they would recognize the dedication, the passion, and the sheer talent he had nurtured in secret. It was a dream that seemed impossible at times, but the music reminded him that it was worth believing in. And so, each evening, he returned to the piano, tapping out notes that carried his story, his struggles, and his unwavering hope into the night, waiting for the moment when the world would finally listen. One morning, as he was walking to work, he noticed a large poster on the wall of a nearby community center. It announced a music competition that was open to anyone, from beginners to professional musicians. The top prize included not only a cash reward but also the chance to perform with a well-known local orchestra. His heart skipped a beat. For the first time, he felt that a real opportunity had appeared, one that could bring him closer to the dream he had been chasing for so long. He stopped in front of the poster and studied it carefully. The event was just a few weeks away, and the registration fee was low enough that he could afford it. But doubts immediately started to creep in. He thought about the professional musicians who would be there, with years of formal training, polished techniques, and reputations already established. Compared to them, he felt inexperienced and unworthy. The thought of performing in front of such a crowd made his stomach twist, and he almost walked away. But then he remembered the countless nights spent at his piano, the hours of practice that no one had seen, the sacrifices he had made. He couldn't let fear stop him now. That evening, he went home and sat at his piano, trying to imagine what his performance would look like. He didn't have a formal plan, just a series of melodies he had created over the years. They were raw, unpolished, but full of emotion. He wondered if they would resonate with an audience, if anyone would understand what he felt when he played. Still, the idea of sharing his music with others filled him with a strange excitement. He decided to register. The next day, he submitted his application online. As soon as he did, a mixture of excitement and fear settled over him. What if he failed? What if everyone laughed at him? Yet, beneath the fear, a small flame of hope burned. This was his chance to step out of the shadows to show what he could do. The decision was made, and there was no turning back. The days that followed were filled with preparation. He knew that he had to practice like never before, refine his pieces, and build the confidence to perform in front of strangers. Each day after work, he would rush home, eat quickly, and sit at his piano for hours. He experimented with melodies, tried new arrangements, and listened to recordings of famous performances to understand timing, dynamics, and emotion. Sometimes he would play until his fingers bled or his head ached, but he refused to stop. Each mistake was a lesson, each small success a step forward. At work, his coworkers noticed a change in him. He seemed quieter, more focused, almost distant. When they asked why, he didn't share much. He didn't want to hear their doubts, their teasing, or their skepticism. Instead, he smiled politely and returned to his tasks, keeping his thoughts to himself. Only his piano and his dreams mattered now. Friends who learned about the competition had mixed reactions. Some tried to encourage him, but many laughed or shook their heads. "Do you really think you can compete with professionals?" one friend asked with a smirk. "You're good, sure, but this is different. You might embarrass yourself." The word stung, but he didn't respond. He had learned long ago that no one else's approval was necessary. The music inside him was enough to keep going. The closer the competition came, the more nervous he became. He began to worry about the details, the lighting, the audience, the judges. He imagined the whispers, the judging eyes, the subtle scoffs from those who believed he didn't belong. He almost considered withdrawing, but every time doubt crept in, he would sit at his piano and play. The music had a way of calming him, grounding him, reminding him why he had started in the first place. He wasn't playing for approval or recognition. He was playing because he couldn't not play. He also realized that preparation wasn't just about technique. It was about emotion, about telling a story through music. He wanted the audience to feel what he felt, to understand the journey he had taken, the struggles and small triumphs that had shaped him. He practiced not just the notes but the feeling behind each chord, the pauses, the crescendos, and the gentle touches that made a melody come alive. This was his secret, the part that no one could teach him, the part that made his music truly his own. As the day of the competition approached, he faced unexpected obstacles. The piano at home needed repairs, and some keys stuck when pressed. He had to adjust, find ways to practice without the instrument responding perfectly. He borrowed a small keyboard from a neighbor for a few days, practicing in a cramped corner of their apartment, trying to make every note count. It was uncomfortable, but it reminded him that adaptability was part of growth. On the night before the competition, sleep came fitfully. His mind replayed every possible scenario, every potential mistake, every face in the audience that might judge him harshly. But when he closed his eyes and imagined himself at the piano, letting the music flow freely, a sense of peace washed over him. He knew he had prepared as much as possible, and no matter the outcome, he had already taken a brave step. The morning of the competition arrived with a mixture of nervous energy and anticipation. He dressed carefully, trying to appear calm, though his heart raced. The community center was already buzzing with activity when he arrived. Musicians of all ages and skill levels were warming up, tuning their instruments, and chatting with each other. He felt a pang of intimidation looking at some of the participants, many of whom carried themselves with the confidence of experience. For a moment, he questioned whether he truly belonged. But then he reminded himself of every evening spent at his piano, every hour of practice, every melody he had created. Those nights were proof that he belonged here. He had worked, he had dreamed, and now he had the chance to share that effort with others. He took a deep breath, feeling a mix of fear and excitement, and began to focus on the music he would play. The first participants performed, and he listened carefully. Some were technically perfect but lacked emotion. Others played with passion but faltered in timing. Watching them, he realized that talent was only part of the equation. What mattered was the story the music told, the connection it created with the listeners. And he had something unique to offer. Authenticity, dedication, and the heartfelt emotion that had guided him every day. Finally, it was his turn. He walked onto the stage, feeling the eyes of the audience on him. The whispers and laughter he had imagined earlier seemed to vanish in the moment. He sat at the piano, hands trembling slightly, and closed his eyes. For a brief second, he allowed himself to feel fear, then pushed it aside. This was not about impressing anyone. This was about expressing himself. As his fingers touched the keys, a quiet, deliberate sound filled the room. The first notes were simple, almost tentative, but full of emotion. Slowly, he built the melody, weaving layers of sound that reflected his journey. The struggle, the hope, the nights spent alone with only the piano as company. The music grew, rising and falling, pulling the audience into the story he had lived silently for years. It was raw, unpolished in a professional sense, but beautiful in its honesty. Each note carried a piece of him, and the room seemed to respond, leaning in to catch every subtle nuance. After his performance began, he felt a strange calm wash over him. The fear that had gripped him for weeks slowly melted away, replaced by a single focus: the music. Every note he played was deliberate, every pause intentional, carrying the emotions he had kept inside for so long. He thought about the nights spent alone, the ridicule, the sacrifices, and allowed all of it to flow through his fingers. The room seemed to quiet, as though the audience were holding their breath, listening to the story that only he could tell. As he played, he noticed some of the professional musicians exchanging surprised glances. The precision of his fingers, the expression in every chord, and the depth of feeling in the piece were unlike anything they had expected from someone they might have dismissed. He didn't see the applause yet, but he could feel the connection forming. Each crescendo, each soft passage, drew the listeners in, making them lean forward, their eyes attentive, their attention fully captured. He had chosen a piece that was a reflection of his journey, combining simple melodies with moments of intricate complexity. It wasn't flashy or technically overbearing, but it had heart. And that heart came from years of dedication, from every struggle he had faced alone in his apartment, and from the countless hours he had spent perfecting a sound that was uniquely his. Every note carried meaning, and every chord told part of the story of who he was. Behind him, the judges scribbled notes and whispered quietly to each other. Some seemed intrigued, some skeptical, but none could deny that there was something unusual about the performance. It wasn't just skill. It was authenticity, a rawness that can't be learned from textbooks or lessons. He had found a voice through his music, and the people in the room were beginning to hear it. As the piece progressed, he felt a growing sense of freedom. The stage, the audience, and the competition all faded away. It was just him and the piano, communicating in a language older than words. He played passages that rose like waves and others that fell gently like rain, each transition smooth yet unexpected. He had never felt so alive, so certain that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The music became a bridge between his inner world and everyone listening, a connection that no applause or criticism could break. The performance wasn't without its moments of tension. A tricky passage approached, one he had struggled with in practice. His hands moved with care, recalling each repetition, each correction. The notes came out clean, and for a moment he allowed himself a quiet smile. That tiny victory meant more than he could explain. It was proof that all the effort had been worth it, that he was capable of more than he had ever imagined. People in the audience began to shift in their seats, drawn to the music. Some eyes glistened, moved by the emotion pouring from the piano. Others were clearly surprised, taken aback by the skill and depth in someone they might have underestimated. A few whispered to the person beside them, unsure how to describe what they were hearing. The room was no longer filled with skepticism or polite attention. It was filled with engagement, a shared experience that transcended doubt. He remembered the advice of a mentor he had met long ago, who had told him that technique is important, but passion and honesty in music are what truly touch people. He had kept that lesson close to his heart, and now he realized its truth. Every note was honest, every chord genuine, and the result was more powerful than he had ever expected. He wasn't just playing. He was telling a story, and everyone could feel it. Time seemed to stretch as he reached the final sections of his piece. The music grew softer, then stronger, pulling the audience along a journey of tension, hope, struggle, and triumph. He felt the weight of the final notes approaching, a moment he had imagined countless times in his small apartment. Now, standing on the stage, it was real. He played the last chord, letting it resonate, holding it just long enough for the sound to fade naturally. The room was silent for a heartbeat, as if the audience needed a moment to absorb what they had just heard. Then, slowly, applause began to fill the room. At first, it was hesitant, polite clapping, but it quickly grew into a wave of appreciation. People were on their feet, cheering, moved by the performance. Some had tears in their eyes. Others were smiling in astonishment. Even the professional musicians, the ones he had feared most, were visibly impressed. Their expressions shifted from doubt to admiration. The laughter and scoffs that had seemed inevitable before the performance had vanished completely. He stood for a moment, letting the sound of the audience wash over him. His chest swelled with a mix of relief, pride, and disbelief. All the nights of practice, the sacrifices, and the self-doubt had led to this moment. And now, in front of people who had underestimated him, he had shown not just skill but heart and dedication. It was a victory far greater than any prize. After stepping away from the piano, he noticed a few people approaching, offering compliments and words of encouragement. Some were fellow competitors, some audience members, and some professional musicians. Each one acknowledged something they saw in his music that they hadn't expected: authenticity, emotion, and talent. He listened to their words, feeling both humbled and validated. For the first time, he realized that the path he had chosen, lonely and challenging as it had been, had value. People had finally seen the effort and passion behind the music. The judges called him forward, and he felt his heart race again. They praised the honesty in his performance, the emotion that resonated with everyone in the room, and the technical skill that belied his lack of formal training. One of the judges, a well-known local pianist, shook his hand and said, "You have something rare. Keep playing and never lose that honesty." Those words, simple as they were, struck him deeply. They confirmed what he had felt all along. That music was not just about perfection, but about connection. As he left the stage, he thought about everything that had led him here. The late nights, the sacrifices, the doubts, and the resilience. He realized that this moment was not just about recognition from others, but about a personal triumph. He had overcome fear, defied expectations, and trusted his own abilities. For the first time, he felt that he belonged in the world of music, not because of approval, but because of his own dedication and heart. That night, as he walked home, he replayed the performance in his mind. He thought about the expressions on the faces in the audience, the applause, and the encouragement he had received. He smiled quietly to himself, feeling a sense of fulfillment that he had never known before. It wasn't the end of his journey, he knew, but it was a turning point, a confirmation that his dreams were not impossible, and that with perseverance and honesty, he could reach them. He returned to his small apartment and sat at the piano, just as he had done countless nights before. This time, however, it was different. The music flowed effortlessly, free from doubt or fear. Each note was a celebration of what he had achieved, a reflection of the journey that had brought him here. The piano, once just an object, now felt like a companion in triumph, a partner in his success. As the music filled the room, he allowed himself to feel something he had rarely allowed before: pride. Not arrogance or superiority, but pride in the effort, the dedication, and the courage it had taken to face the world with his music. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, more opportunities to grow, and more moments to prove himself. But for now, he allowed the music to carry him, to remind him that he was capable, that he was seen, and that his passion had power. And in that quiet apartment, the piano played not just melodies, but a story of resilience, determination, and the reward of staying true to oneself. It was a story that had only just begun, but in that moment, he knew that anything was possible if he continued to believe and persevere. The day of the final round arrived, bringing with it a wave of excitement and nerves. The competition hall was filled with spectators, each person finding their seats, chatting quietly, and anticipating the performances. He felt a familiar flutter in his chest, the mixture of fear and thrill that always accompanied him before playing. But he also carried a quiet confidence now, born from the experiences of the previous round and the realization that he had something valuable to share. This time, he focused not on the audience or the judges, but on the music and the story he wanted to tell. As he waited backstage, he observed the other competitors preparing. Some were warming up with practiced precision, others pacing nervously. He noticed a few professional musicians, impeccably dressed, adjusting their sheet music and making last-minute checks. He couldn't help but feel a flicker of intimidation, remembering all the times he had doubted himself. But he quickly reminded himself of the countless nights of practice, of the melodies he had nurtured alone, and the emotions he had poured into his music. That quiet determination gave him strength. The announcer called his name, and he walked toward the piano, feeling the gaze of the audience settle on him. He took a deep breath and sat down, letting his hands hover over the keys. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel the nerves, acknowledging them without letting them take control. Then he closed his eyes and began to play. The first notes were soft and deliberate, drawing the listeners in with a gentle, almost tentative melody. But soon, the music began to grow, carrying emotion and depth that resonated throughout the hall. The piece he had prepared was one that captured the highs and lows of his journey. It began with simple, introspective chords, reflecting the long nights of solitude and practice. Gradually, more complex harmonies wove into the melody, expressing struggle, persistence, and the relentless pursuit of a dream. Each note was carefully placed, every pause meaningful, and every crescendo intentional. He didn't just play the piano. He told a story that only he could tell, a story that reflected his life and his passion. As he played, he noticed the audience leaning forward, captivated by the music. There were no whispers, no distractions, only focused attention. Some faces showed surprise, some awe, and some were visibly moved. He realized that, for the first time, he was truly connecting with people through his music. Every emotion, every effort, every moment of doubt and hope that had gone into the creation of this piece was now reaching them, and it was an exhilarating feeling. In the audience, a few professional musicians exchanged looks of admiration. They were skilled, experienced, and well-trained, yet there was something raw and honest about his performance that could not be ignored. He didn't rely on flashy techniques or showmanship. He relied on authenticity, passion, and the connection between his hands and the keys. That authenticity carried weight, and it became clear to everyone present that the music was coming from a deep and genuine place. The music grew more intense, moving through variations in rhythm and tempo that reflected challenges he had faced in life. He played passages that were fast and intricate, showcasing precision, and then moved to gentle, lingering notes that evoked quiet reflection. The transitions were smooth, the dynamics natural, and the overall effect mesmerizing. Each chord resonated in the hall, drawing the audience deeper into the story he was telling. He felt a profound sense of freedom as he continued. The stage, the competition, and the audience faded from his awareness. There was only him and the piano, communicating through a language that transcended words. Each key pressed, each note sustained, was a bridge between his inner world and the listeners. He thought about the sacrifices, the ridicule, and the long hours of solitary practice, and in that moment, every struggle felt worthwhile. During the final segment, he incorporated subtle improvisations, adding personal touches that made the performance entirely his own. These moments reflected the creativity he had nurtured over the years, the willingness to take risks, and the courage to express himself fully. The audience seemed to respond intuitively, leaning in, some closing their eyes, letting the music wash over them. He realized that music was not just about perfection or technique. It was about emotion, connection, and honesty. The final notes approached, and he allowed the piece to build to a powerful climax. His hands moved with confidence, guided by both skill and feeling, as he brought the melody to its resolution. He held the last chord, letting it linger, allowing the resonance to fill the hall. The room was silent for a heartbeat, a collective pause in which every listener absorbed the weight of what they had just experienced. Then the applause erupted. It started softly, hesitant at first, and quickly grew into a thunderous ovation. People rose to their feet, cheering, clapping, and whistling. Some had tears in their eyes, others smiles of astonishment, and many were visibly moved by the performance. The professional musicians who had seemed intimidating now looked genuinely impressed, nodding in appreciation and exchanging approving glances. The laughter and doubt that had haunted him before had vanished entirely. As he stood and bowed, a wave of emotion washed over him. Relief, pride, and joy mixed together, creating a feeling he had rarely experienced. This was more than a moment of recognition. It was a validation of years of dedication, of sacrifices made in silence, and of unwavering belief in his own abilities. He had stepped into the world, faced doubt, and shown not only his skill but also his heart. After leaving the stage, several people approached to congratulate him. Fellow competitors, audience members, and even professional musicians offered words of encouragement and praise. They acknowledged the emotion in his music, the dedication behind every note, and the courage it took to perform with such authenticity. Listening to their words, he felt humbled and grateful. The support and recognition he received were affirmations of his journey and the choices he had made. The judges called him forward to discuss his performance. They spoke highly of his musicality, his ability to convey emotion, and the originality of his piece. One of the judges, a respected pianist in the community, shook his hand and said, "You have a gift, and more importantly, you have the courage to share it. Keep playing with honesty, and you will go far." Those words resonated deeply, a mixture of encouragement and acknowledgement that confirmed what he had always felt. That music was not just about talent, but about the heart behind it. As the competition concluded and awards were announced, he felt a sense of calm satisfaction. He didn't need to win to feel accomplished. He had achieved something far more meaningful. He had shared his story through music, touched the hearts of listeners, and proved to himself that perseverance and passion could overcome doubt. The applause, recognition, and admiration were welcome, but the true reward lay in the connection he had created and the confidence he had gained. Walking home that evening, he reflected on the day's events. The city streets, usually noisy and chaotic, felt different somehow. Every sound, every passing car, and every distant voice seemed to echo the music he had played, a reminder of the journey that had brought him here. He thought about the nights spent alone, the sacrifices, and the determination that had guided him. And he felt a quiet pride, knowing that he had faced fear, embraced challenge, and allowed his music to speak. Returning to his apartment, he sat at the piano once more. The keys felt familiar beneath his fingers, yet there was a new sense of possibility. He played freely, improvising, exploring new melodies, and letting the music carry him. This performance was not about competition or judgment. It was about expression, growth, and joy. Every note was a celebration of his journey and a step toward the future he had always dreamed of. In the quiet of his apartment, he understood something important. The music was more than a skill, more than a performance. It was a reflection of life itself. It told of struggle, persistence, hope, and triumph. And as he played, he realized that the journey was far from over. There would be new challenges, new opportunities, and new stages to face. But he was ready, strengthened by experience, guided by passion, and inspired by the knowledge that authenticity and dedication could create moments of true magic. After the competition, life changed in ways he had never imagined. People approached him on the street, at work, and even online, praising his performance. Some had watched videos of the event that were shared by audience members, and the reach of his music began to grow beyond the walls of the community center. It was strange at first to have strangers recognize and admire something that had once been his private world. Yet, he embraced it with humility, understanding that recognition was not the end goal, but a sign that his music had touched others. At work, his co-workers treated him differently. Those who had once laughed or doubted him now nodded with respect, sometimes asking about his next performance. Even the people who had been skeptical seemed to acknowledge that his dedication had led to something extraordinary. He didn't hold grudges for the teasing he had endured. Instead, he quietly celebrated the fact that he had stayed true to his passion despite the doubts around him. Their surprise was not his concern. What mattered was that he had proven to himself what he could achieve. In the weeks that followed, invitations began to arrive for him to perform at small events, local gatherings, and charity functions. These opportunities allowed him to connect with new audiences and to continue sharing his music. Each performance reinforced his confidence and deepened his understanding of how music could move people. He realized that his piano was not just an instrument, but a bridge connecting him to others, a tool for communication that transcended words. He also began to think about the future more seriously. Before, He had played primarily for himself, practicing and exploring melodies in private. Now, with the possibility of wider audiences and more public performances, he considered how to refine his skills further. He sought advice from musicians he admired, learned new techniques, and experimented with different styles. Though he had started without formal training, he discovered that continuous learning and curiosity could expand his abilities even more. Yet, despite the growing attention and opportunities, he remained grounded. He continued to practice in the quiet of his apartment, revisiting the melodies that had shaped his journey. The piano remained a sanctuary, a place to explore, create, and reflect. He understood that the music itself was the most important part, more than applause, awards, or recognition. Each note carried a part of his story, and that authenticity was what truly mattered. One evening, after a long day of preparation for an upcoming performance, he sat at the piano and thought back on his journey. He remembered the early mornings when he had to rush from work to practice, the nights filled with doubt and frustration, and the moments when he questioned whether he was good enough. He realized that every struggle had shaped him, every challenge had strengthened him, and every small victory had led to the larger ones. The path had not been easy, but it had been his own, and that made it meaningful. As he played a new composition he had been working on, he felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond recognition or success. The music flowed effortlessly, a combination of skill, emotion, and intuition. He experimented with variations, adding subtle nuances that reflected his personal growth. It was a reminder that music, like life, was a journey without a definitive end. There was always more to explore, more to learn, and more to express. His story also inspired others. Young musicians who had once thought their dreams were out of reach began to reach out, sharing their struggles and seeking advice. He spoke to them about persistence, dedication, and the importance of staying true to one's passion. He encouraged them to embrace challenges, to learn from mistakes, and to understand that progress often comes quietly, in moments of practice and reflection that may go unnoticed by the world. His journey had become a testament to what could be achieved with patience and determination. He reflected on the competition and the pivotal moment when he had performed on stage, facing an audience full of doubt and expectation. That moment had changed him, not because of the applause or recognition, but because it had shown him the power of belief and perseverance. He realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. And that lesson extended far beyond music. It applied to every aspect of life. Over time, he continued to perform at various events, slowly building a reputation as a talented and passionate pianist. Each performance was an opportunity to share a part of himself, to tell a story through sound, and to connect with people on a deeper level. His music became a source of comfort and inspiration, not only for himself but for those who listened. He understood that true success was not about fame or wealth, but about impact, connection, and the joy of creating something meaningful. Despite growing recognition, he never lost sight of the journey that had brought him here. He still practiced in the quiet of his apartment, exploring new melodies and revisiting old ones. He took time to reflect on his experiences, to consider how each note he played could convey emotion and tell a story. The piano remained a companion, a teacher, and a guide, reminding him of the value of dedication and authenticity. He also began collaborating with other musicians, sharing ideas, and learning from their experiences. These collaborations expanded his horizons, introducing him to new techniques, styles, and ways of thinking about music. He found joy in the exchange, understanding that growth often comes from connecting with others and being open to new perspectives. Yet, no matter the collaborations or accolades, he always returned to the piano, the place where his journey began and where he felt most at home. As the years went by, his story became well known in the local music community. People admired his journey from an underdog with no formal training to a pianist who could touch hearts with his music. They spoke of his determination, his resilience, and the honesty in his performances. Yet, for him, the recognition was secondary. What mattered most was the music itself, the connection it created, and the fulfillment that came from following his passion. He continued to compose new pieces, each one reflecting his experiences, emotions, and growth. Some were performed publicly, others remained private, explored in the quiet of his apartment. He found joy in both, understanding that creation was as much about the process as it was about the outcome. The piano had become a lifelong companion, a source of solace, and a way to express the deepest parts of himself. Looking back on his journey, he realized that the laughter and doubt he had faced were not obstacles but lessons. They had taught him resilience, patience, and the importance of self-belief. The moments of struggle had shaped his music, giving it depth and authenticity that could not have been achieved otherwise. Every note he played carried the story of perseverance, of dedication, and of unwavering faith in his own abilities. In quiet moments, when the world felt distant and the piano keys were beneath his fingers, he reflected on what he had learned. Success was not about proving others wrong, but about proving to oneself what was possible. It was about finding joy in creation, connection in expression, and meaning in persistence. And through music, he had discovered all of these things, creating a life that was rich, fulfilling, and deeply personal. The journey continued, with new challenges, new performances, and new opportunities to grow. But he faced each one with the same dedication and passion that had guided him from the beginning. He knew that as long as he stayed true to himself and to his music, every step of the journey would be meaningful. And in that knowledge, he found peace, fulfillment, and a lasting sense of accomplishment.